Hello and welcome back. Today we are talking about LINQ to SQL. This will be an introductory level overview of LINQ to SQL. LINQ to SQL is a new feature built into the .NET 3.5 framework as well as Visual Studio 2005. The objectives for today is to learn how to create a connection to our database, how to use the LINQ to SQL Designer to create our mappings, and then create some simple LINQ queries. This is not meant to be a in-depth overview of LINQ and LINQ to SQL. We'll have more screencasts in the future to go into more details on how to create more complicated queries. Let's go ahead and get started. The first thing you need to do when creating a LINQ to SQL when using LINQ to SQL is to create a data connection. So go to your Server Explorer, right-click Data Connection, go ahead and click Add Connections. I'm going to be using a database on my local host. In fact, I'm actually going to use the actual database that drives the dimecast.net website. You can provide SQL Server authentication or Windows authentication. Here I'm using SQL, so go ahead and click OK. And you'll notice that I now have a data connection and I can view all the tables and all the views and all the stored procedures and all that good stuff. It's no different than if I was doing it via SQL Query Analyzer. Well, now that we have a data connection, let's go ahead and create our database context class, which is our DBML. So I'm going to go Add New Item. Wait for this to pop up. And if I go down to Data, I'll see that there's a new template called LINQ to SQL Classes. I'm going to call this Demo. This actually will create the data class that holds your data context as well as all your generated entities. If I go over to Solution Explorer, you'll see there's my demo.dbml, and then there's a layout file, which is here on my screen, and then the designer file. The designer is, the designer.cs file is what's going to hold your data context as well as all your DTO files that get generated. Well, let's go ahead and actually create some DTO mappings. So I'm going to use the episode comment, and let's just go episode tag tables and drag those onto my designer. Now that I have created my episode and episode tag database tables, I've actually can see over my designer classes that it actually will create my DTO classes for me. So here's my episode comment, and if I collapse this, I have my episode tag. Let's take a look real quick at some of the markings that they put on this stuff for us. On the table, which is my DTO, they actually put the table attribute and give it the name I'm looking for, and they do that on all the different DTOs. And then if you want to see how it maps to a column, for each of the public properties, in this case ID, episode ID, whatnot, they actually give it the attribute column, and then some various other properties to tell it how to use that column and how it works and what data type it is and all that good stuff. This is all important. This is the glue that holds the LINQ to SQL and the mapping stuff together. It's very good to know. You shouldn't need to modify this at all. If you do want to hand create it, you can do that, or you can just let the IDE generate itself. Now, looking at this, the designer again, you'll notice it actually creates my relationships for me, which is key. It'll even do stuff like show me which my key properties and all that good stuff. And I can go a step further. Maybe I don't like the name of my table in my database, so I just want to call this tag. This is actually very useful when I want to rename the table because the name of the table in the database is very cryptic or has no meaning for my application. So actually go ahead and rename it. One thing I want to point out as well is there's some properties you can modify on your data context. You can change things like the base class, the connection string, what namespace the context uses, what namespace your entities as a whole use. So there's some flexibility here. There's actually been some need for this already in my usage of LINQ to SQL. So knowing that this stuff exists is very beneficial. Well, now that we've seen how we can create our mappings and how the mapping code gets generated by looking at our designer.cs file, let's go ahead and create a couple simple LINQ statements. I'm going to go ahead and do this using unit test. I'm using the NUnit testing framework. Of course, you can use any testing framework if you want. I've already set up the shell of my stuff. I'm going to just do a simple select all. So the first thing you need to do whenever you're going to query against a LINQ to SQL data context, actually create an instance of that data context. You'll notice here I'm not providing the connection string, I can do that. That is an overloaded parameter of the data context. You'll see I can pass in a data connection object or just a string. This is useful if you want to change the connection at runtime for, like, say, a production database or QA database. I'm going to actually create a query object. I'm using the keyword var here as anonymous type because LINQ to SQL will return you back either an IEnumerable or IQueryable object by default. And right now I just want a list of IEnumerables. So I'm going to do let's do E in dc.episodes, select E. Oops, sorry. All this statement here is doing is saying, basically, go give me everything from the episodes table. E is your alias. Here's setting up your actual table. And here I'm doing select E. Now I can iterate over this by simply doing a for each query, for each over the query object, because like I said, it is an IEnumerable. And I can iterate over that. Let's actually output some stuff to the screen here. So I'm going to do debug.writeLine, and I'm going to do episode episode number. And actually I could iterate over this. But let's say I don't want actually get a full-blown episode object. I actually only want to return back a few properties, because by doing select E, I'll get all the properties. I can actually do that by doing something like e.id, e.episode number, and so forth and so forth. Let's do description. And I can even go a step further. Maybe I don't like the column name, episode number, and I just want to call it number. I can actually even go as far as renaming it. You notice that down here, my usage of the episode number actually turned red because it now knows that it's not episode number, it is number. That's where the IntelliSense comes into play. Let's go ahead and run this. I'm running this via the NUnit test, or I'm sorry, the ReSharper test runner. If you don't have ReSharper, go ahead and use the NUnit IDE or your testing frameworks IDE, or you can even use something like testdriven.net. Now at this point I've ran and executed the query, but all it's really done is generated a SQL statement for me. LINQ to SQL uses delayed execution, doesn't actually hit the database till the first time you request data from it. Let's go ahead and step over this and see what happens. I now have a number 1, and I could just iterate over this over and over again. And if I look at my output window, you'll see I've iterated 1, 2, 3, and 4. Those are the only values in my table. So we'll iterate over it one after another. Now this is a very simple example. Let's actually make it a little bit more complicated. Let's do a join. That's a pretty common scenario in doing SQL. I'm going to go ahead and delete this auto-generate syntax that ReSharper gives me because I want to type it in by hand. Let's do tags. So I'll call it tag in, don't rename it, tag in dc.tags. Now I'm going to join it on the episode.id equals, auto generation stuff there, tag.episode ID. Now this is going to do a outer join for me. If I want to do an inner join. If I want to do an outer join, I could do it a little bit differently, and we'll get into that in future screencasts. But right here, I've now joined to my tags table. Let's go ahead and use a value from my tag table. So I'm going to do tag tag type ID. You'll now notice that tag type ID pops into my IntelliSense. So there you go. I've created a simple query, returned the results, I've then modified that to be a select all, and I've actually created this as an anonymous type. If I want to go a step further, if I had a concrete object, I could put an object name in here. If I knew that these properties map directly to another object in my system, I can actually do it, and it would actually do the mappings for me instead of using anonymous types. One thing to keep in mind is if you're using anonymous objects, you can't return those outside of this method. They're only useful inside of this method because the compiler only knows about it in the context of this method. So just kind of review what we've gone over today. We've learned how to create our server connection, our database connection. We've learned how to use the designer to drag and drop tables, to rename tables if so needed, and to look at the various properties available in the data context. We've taken a quick look at the code that's generated for us to see how it's actually used and some of the different attributes that are added, such as table, such as column. And then finally, we've gone ahead and created a very simple statement against our LINQ database, LINQ SQL database. Like I said, in future episodes, we'll go into more detail on how to use the DataContext to do more advanced, sophisticated querying. But that about does it for today. Hope you learned something, and until next time.